Hello everyone, I'm David Smerdon and welcome to week 9 of our economics course. This week we're looking at externalities and public goods, and this is kind of our bridging week, so to speak, between microeconomics and macroeconomics, but is also very much related to the second video supplement that I uploaded for this course about the relationship between economics and politics. So far, in most of the weeks that we've focused on, there's been support for the arguments for the economic right. That is, that government intervention doesn't make much sense. The free markets generally lead to efficient solutions. We sort of looked in the last couple of weeks about situations where this is not always true, such as monopolies, although we balance the arguments both for and against the social impact of monopolies and oligopolies. This week, we're really going to focus on those fundamental economic arguments that support the economic left, and also for the most part the political left. And that is that there are a lot of situations where government intervention makes sense from a social welfare perspective. But before we get to that, as is becoming our custom, let's go into some feedback. So I want to start with a game theory question. A game theory question that actually was used in a previous exam. So it's a good indication of the sort of questions at this level that are used to test your knowledge. And we'll take a nice local example. So it's about business strategy. It's a simple two-player game, two-player situation that's very common to business. And we're going to look at Honor Roll Bakery and Merlot as our two economic agents here. So imagine that these are the only two suppliers of sandwiches on the UQ campus. We'll imagine that both of these suppliers have constant average costs of $2 per sandwich, and we'll just make everything homogeneous. There's just one type of sandwich. Each store can choose either to set a high price or a low price for their sandwich. So $10 is the high price, $5 is a low price. These are some fancy sandwiches. So when both stores set high prices, the market demand on campus for sandwiches is 10,000 sandwiches a month, and that's split evenly between the two stores. If they both set a low price, well, good news for us, cheap sandwiches, and the market demand is 18,000 sandwiches a month, which is again split evenly. But if one store sets a low price and the other sets a high price, the low price store sells 15,000 sandwiches a month, and the high priced store sells only 2,000 sandwiches. So with any good game that we analyze in game theory, we need to know the players, we need to know the actions and the payoffs. We have two players, two actions, low price or high price, and the payoffs here are in terms of profit. So each store wants to maximize their total profit. We'll need to calculate what those profits are in each situation. The question is, analyze the pricing decision of the two firms as a non-cooperative game in the following steps. Step 1, construct the 2x2 payoff matrix, where the elements of each cell of the matrix are the two stores' profits. Step 2, derive the equilibrium strategies for both stores. And then step 3, identify some 2x2 game that we've seen in class with a similar payoff structure and explain why these two games are sort of equivalent. So what you need to do is to do these 3 steps by filling in, first of all, your 2x2 payoff matrix, which looks like this. I want you to have a go at this now, so pause the video or go back a bit if you want to see the instructions again, and when you're ready, restart from here and we'll go through the answers. Okay, are you ready? Well, let's see how we can fill out this table. We can start, let's start in the top left where both the bakery and Merlot set high prices. Well, if they both set high prices, market demand is 10,000 sandwiches per month. Split that in half, that's 5,000 sandwiches to each of the suppliers. selling at $10 a sandwich, but with an average cost of $2 a sandwich. So they're making $8 profit per sandwich. They're selling 5,000 sandwiches. That's $40,000 in profit. We'll get rid of the thousands there, but we end up with 40, 40 as the profits in terms of thousands under a situation where both sell high prices. Now we can do that for the rest of the cells, and we end up with something reasonably symmetric as follows. Notice that if one of the stores sets a low price and the other sets a high price, they get very high profits. The low price setter will get 45,000, the high price setter only 16. So that's step one, getting that 2x2 payoff matrix. Now we definitely have all the elements we need to solve the game. So what we want to do now is look at things in terms of best responses. So we'll start with the bakery, honor roll bakery, and to work out its best response, we need to first condition on some decision by the other firm. So we start with thinking about what happens if Merlot does this, what's the best thing we should do? What happens if Merlot does that? What's the best thing we should do? So what happens if Merlot sets a high price? Well, let's look at the bakery, and the bakery can set a high price and get 40, or a low price and get 45. We're looking at the first column. Well, obviously 45 is better than 40, so we circle or put an asterisk or underline that particular payoff. So that's a line under the 45. And that signifies that honor roll bakery should set a low price if Merlot sets a high price. And just to recap, in each cell, the first payoff is the payoff to the row player, bakery, and the second payoff is for the column player, Merlot. What happens if Merlot sets a low price? Well, then the choice is between 16 and 27. So we're looking at that first column under low price. Well, 27's better. So we put a line under that, and that tells us that again the bakery should set a low price. So in both situations the bakery should set a low price. And what we learned is that if a player plays the same strategy no matter what the other person does, we call that strategy a dominant strategy. So here we can see that the bakery has a dominant strategy of setting a low price. Now the game is symmetric, which means we could just fill out the symmetric lines for Merlot, or we could go through it systematically. So this would be, what should Merlot do if the bakery sets a high price? The answer is set a low price. What should Merlot do if bakery sets a low price? The answer is set a low price. And then we look for any cell where we have two underlined payoffs, and there's only one, low price, low price. So what have we got here to identify the sort of game where this happens? Well, notice that low price gives both firms profits of 27 each, whereas high price would give both firms profits of 40 each. So it would be better for the two together if they could both agree to set high prices in some sort of cartel arrangement or so forth, but there would always be an incentive for at least one of the players to deviate to make higher profit. In fact, there are two dominant strategies, and in a Nash equilibrium they both need to be played, and that gives us this 27-27, which is essentially the same game as the prisoner's dilemma. So this is just the same situation as the prisoner's dilemma, or also the fuel station example we saw in the last lecture between BP and Caltex. Okay, so that's the answer there. Now, what about the guessing game? At the end of the last lecture, I asked you to play a little game with me and submit some answers on Blackboard. The guessing game went as follows. You and every student submits one number from 0 to 100 inclusive, so integers. And the winner of the game is the student who guesses the closest to 2/3 the average of all student guesses. Now, you're probably sick of the prisoner's dilemma by now, but this is showing you how the same techniques can be applied to a much wider and more complicated strategy space. So here, instead of 2 players, we have however many players play the game. I think there were 55 who submitted answers, so much bigger number. And instead of just 2 strategies, high price, low price, there are 101 strategies. So these are the different numbers that you can select. So 55 players, 101 different strategies. Obviously a much more complicated scenario. However, it's still possible to identify the one Nash equilibrium that exists in this game. Well, actually, the only one that's that matters for what we're interested in here. So what happened? What were the guesses that were put forward? Well, this is what the class distribution looked like. Here, the height of the bars represents the percentage of students who chose this number. And along the bottom there, we've got the guess that was put forward. So we see one big spike in the middle there, and that's the most popular answer put forward, which was 50. 11% of students chose 50. The most popular answers after that were 43, 22, and 0, interestingly enough. 5% of students chose each of these ones. The lowest pick was 0, 3 students chose that. The highest pick was 77, and in fact 5 answers were above 66. Now anything above 66.67 is not mathematically possible to be the correct answer that's chosen. And why is that? Well, you want to get as close as possible to 2/3 of the winning number. Even if all the other students in the class chose 100, that means the winning number would be 67. So it doesn't really make any sense to be choosing numbers above 66 unless you think that everybody else in the class is really not paying attention. So this was the distribution. What's the average there? Well, it was 34.5. That was the average guess put forward. Of course, what we really want to know is what 2/3 of that is. 2/3 is exactly 23. And while a number of students chose 22, there was only one student who chose 23. And that student is... I have no idea, because you were asked also to put your student number down, and there were only a couple of students, I think about 3, who decided not to answer the student number question, and the winning guess was one of those. So we'll never know who the hero we need was in this game. How do we analyze this game? By the way, I should say that 23 is actually not bad at all as a winning guess, and we'll talk about some of the empirical averages in a bit. But how do we analyze this game? Well, you don't just choose a random number in this game. You should put in a bit of thought into this, and nor should you choose any number above 67. As we spoke before, it's strictly dominated by choosing 67 itself, where at least you get some small possible chance of winning. But if you believe that other participants are rational, then it means that you believe that other participants are not going to choose anything above 67 either. So if other students are not going to choose anything above 67, then it makes sense that you don't choose anything above 2/3 of 67, which is, I'm not sure exactly, somewhere around 50, I don't know, something like that. But it doesn't make much sense then. But if you think that everyone is as smart as you and isn't going to choose anything above 50, then you shouldn't choose anything above 2/3 of 50, and so on and so on. So you can see that as long as you assume that other people in the class are paying some degree of attention, you should keep choosing lower and lower numbers until all the different numbers are eliminated, and the only number remaining that makes any sense for you to choose is exactly 0, which quite a few students in the class did do. So this game is not called the guessing game. In reality, it's called the beauty contest game. We'll talk about why that is in a moment. And it's a very interesting tool to get an idea of how many steps ahead you think and how many steps ahead you think that others in the class think. So 0 is the only Nash equilibrium in this game. If we assume that everyone is playing perfectly rationally and is thinking ahead and thinks that others are playing rationally, 0, everyone choosing 0 is the only Nash equilibrium. But that never happens in reality when we play this game. In fact, what we find are these levels of rationality. People aren't infinitely rational. So level 1 here is choosing 2/3 of 50. Choosing 2/3 of 50, which is about 33, which was a very common choice. In fact, the mean was 34.5. So that means that you believe that people are choosing randomly between 0 and 100, which means that the average guess will be 50. So therefore you choose 2/3 of the average. You assume that everyone else is being random and you're a bit smarter than everyone else. Then there's another level up. The next level is someone who thinks that everyone else is level 1. So you think that everyone else in the class is at least smart enough to realize that 33 is a good guess. And so you choose 2/3 of that. So you choose 22, which in fact many students did. And the correct answer was 23 in our class. So that means that most people who are choosing this 22 believe that the rest of the class has that level 1 level of rationality. Then of course we can go further, we can go level 3. Level 3 means you assume everyone else is level 2, which means the mean guess is 22, you should choose 2/3 of that, which is 15, and so forth. So this helps us to get an idea of where the class sits in terms of their level of rationality. And of course at the end, at higher levels of rationality, we end up again at this 0. So why is this called the beauty contest? Well, it's a form of, also called a Keynesian beauty contest, and we're going to talk more about Keynes in the macroeconomic courses. And he came up with this thought experiment where he said, well, imagine that a newspaper runs a contest where it says, guess the 6 most attractive faces from 100 photographs. And you want to guess them, and if you guess the 6 most attractive, then you win a prize. But of course, how are these photos going to be ranked for attractiveness? Well, in terms of the popularity of what everybody else is choosing. So your sophisticated strategy is to choose what you think others are going to choose are the most handsome faces, even if you don't personally find them very attractive. But then that next level up is realizing that this is what a lot of other people are going to do. So you need to choose what you think that others think are the most handsome faces, and so forth. And Keynes used this example to illustrate the stock market. The idea that for a lot of stocks where the inherent value is sort of neither here nor there, what you're essentially doing is trying to predict what others predict that value is going to be. And then other more sophisticated traders are trying to predict what you predict that others predict the value is going to be, and so forth. And he has a nice quote where he talks about this. He says, it's not a case of choosing those faces that to the best of one's judgment are really the prettiest, nor even those that the average opinion genuinely thinks are prettiest. We've reached this third degree, this higher level, where we devote our intelligences to anticipating what average opinion expects the average opinion to be. And there are those, I believe, who practice the 4th, 5th, and higher degrees, and so forth. So Keynes wrote about this in the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which was sort of just prior to the Second World War. And we'll talk more about his influence on modern macroeconomics and also his role during the war once we get into the macroeconomic components of this course. Before we move on to government intervention, externalities, I wanted to also just give you one relatively recent example of government intervention in markets. And this was something that happened in September of 2019. There's always a lot of interest and action in what happens in the oil market. At the moment, we've got this very odd situation where some holders of oil stocks are actually paying people to take the oil off their hands. That's how low oil prices have fallen. But we saw quite the opposite situation back in September, and this was when there was an attack that occurred on an oil processing plant. I believe it was in Saudi Arabia, and this led to an immediate explosion in the oil price. I think it jumped about 20% within 24 to 48 hours, and people sort of went nuts about this. Trump sought to restore calm to the people about this and tweeted very eloquently that there was plenty of oil. And he went a bit further than that. In fact, he said he's actually doing something more constructive in a policy sense based on this attack. He authorized the release of oil from the strategic petroleum reserves if need be. And most importantly, this bigger tweet here, I've informed all appropriate agencies to expedite approvals of the oil pipelines currently in the permitting process in Texas and various other states. Now, Trump was ridiculed about this by many people, not just on social media, but also political commentators, with a very similar argument that's also written here. How do pipelines construction in the future deal with the immediate supply interruption? How stupid, blah, blah, blah. Now, it's not often I find myself defending the economic policies of Trump, because usually he's not following conventional theories there at all. However, in this case, there was certainly some logic actually to what he did by announcing this future increase in supply, because the attack on the Saudi processing plant had led to an immediate supply shock, moving the supply curve to the left, and that's what led to this massive increase in price. Now, Trump's announcement is about increasing future supply, and what's the effect going to be on future prices if supply shifts to the right? Well, that's going to lead to a decrease in prices. And we know that one of the things that affects what suppliers do today is what they expect the prices to be in the future. And if suppliers expect the prices in the future to go down, they're going to increase supply today. So that's actually going to lead to a movement today immediately of a supply curve to the right. And in that sense, the announcement by Trump made perfect logic from what we've seen so far in this course. Let's move on now to today's topic. We've looked for many weeks about the difference between imperfect and perfect markets. We've had this slide up over and over again, and usually we've been focusing on either perfectly competitive markets, or we've been systematically moving down this list and relaxing each of these assumptions for perfect competition. Now we're going to relax the assumptions about externalities, and also about whether or not goods are excludable and rival. And like I said earlier, when we look at the relationship between politics and economics, there's that first argument that any sort of government intervention should reduce economic efficiency if we have competitive markets in a capitalist society. So that's using economics 101 to try to argue for the right of politics. Now we're going to look at the flip side of that, which is saying that there are situations where government intervention actually increases economic efficiency, and those are in situations where we have some sort of deviation from free markets, sometimes which is called market failure. And that's the economic left, the supporting arguments of that side of politics. And then the question is, well, which of these situations is more important, and which is the more common situation we find today? Most of our markets largely free markets that reflect the conditions of perfect competition, or are most of the important markets situations where we have one of these violated assumptions and government intervention actually makes sense? So let's start with the first of these dot points that we're going to look at, and that's the situation where there are externalities, and we're going to see what happens then. So this is a situation where there's market failure and positive government intervention. And one of the most important markets, and yes, it is a market, is that of pollution and emissions. So global warming and climate change are obviously massive topics in the world today. Adam Smith's argument from the very start was about markets being efficient through the price mechanism, or the so-called invisible hand, in which case economic agents, you, me, firms like BHP, whatever, can act in selfish ways, but in a way that leads to socially efficient outcomes. But what we're going to see is that there are situations where these are not socially efficient. And the easiest example to think about off the top of your head are situations where we have excess pollution. Now, these situations happen when we have what are called externalities. So what's an externality? That's any benefit or cost that affects someone who is not directly involved in the production or the consumption of the good or service. So, whoops, left out Dilbert's punchline. So far we've been looking at the Pareto optimality, or the benefits of trade to both the consumer and the producer. We get this total surplus, which is made up of the producer surplus and the consumer surplus. But the question is, what happens if there are other parties that are affected by a transaction between a producer and a consumer? Well, they can be affected in different ways. There can be a private cost. The private cost is that to the producer of the good or the service, but then there's the social cost. And this takes into account the cost that's being applied also to those who are external to that transaction. So these are these external costs there, or so-called pollution costs. So, Ford makes a car, they sell it to someone who buys the car, but in the process of making the car at their production plant, they produce pollution that is right next to a farm or something like this, and we need to take into account those external costs that are going to that farmer. Likewise, while the private benefit are the benefits received by the consumer of the good or the service, there's also a social benefit that can affect others not involved in that transaction. And quite often we call this a positive consumption externality. There's that term externality again. And again, we can go further into formalizing these definitions. For example, a negative externality in production is a cost accrued to someone who is not involved in the production of a given good. We could also have a positive externality in production, although these are relatively rare. A negative externality in consumption, these are a little bit more common. So this is a cost accrued to someone who is not involved in the consumption of a given good. Such as if somebody consumes cigarettes and they're around you and you don't like smoking. Or a positive externality in consumption. Now these are quite common. So 7 and 9 here are quite common. This is a benefit accrued to someone who is not involved in the consumption of a given good. And we'll talk about some examples of this coming up. So we'll start with this example, this point 9, positive externalities in consumption, because they're reasonably common. So this means that the social benefit from the consumption activity, when we take into account the external benefits, is greater than the private benefit from the activity. The total benefits are greater than just the benefits that the person who decides to consume the good would personally get. And that means that if we just look at these private benefits and the person consuming the good, such as vaccines or anything to do with your health or something like this, or say you've got neighbors and you decide to build a nice garden in your front yard, which is going to benefit your neighbor next to you, these sort of things. If you don't take into account the other people and you decide whether or not to pay for your garden, to pay for a vaccine, to pay for whatever, the amount that you choose to consume is going to be lower than what we as a society would like you to consume. And the price is lower than the socially efficient price. So examples of this are university education, and as I said, parents vaccinating their children. So if we're not meeting those quantities and prices that are socially efficient, that means that there's going to be some efficiency loss to society. And we know what that's called already. That's called a dead weight loss. So if we don't account for these external benefits that can assume, we're not maximizing the social surplus to society. For example, your education, in principle at least, should lead to a knowledge gain and a production gain to society as a whole. So therefore, the rest of Australia should be grateful for you undertaking this education and therefore should subsidise your education, which in fact the Australian government does do, and does it directly because it expects to reap benefits from you in the future. Likewise, vaccinating your children is something that is going to benefit others because it reduces their chances of getting sick. If we don't take into account those things and we allow people to make private decisions at free market prices, then there will be underconsumption, which means that there will be a dead weight loss to society and the invisible hand principle fails. One solution to these things is private negotiation, and we'll see how that works in the case of a negative production externality soon. So we've mentioned a few of these different examples. Here are some other ones as well. Anything to do with your fitness and health, basically, education and social networking, and anything basically where there are spillovers to others not engaged in the activity. So for example, you decide whether or not to buy things that reinforce the fireproofness of your house and the fire safety of your house. you do it usually taking into account the cost to you of buying such materials and such works versus the benefits to you of your house not getting burnt. But you don't take into account the fact that if your house is fireproof and a bushfire comes through, that's also going to protect your neighbors. So there's a positive externality there in you doing these things. The other big one from a policy sense is about externalities in production, and here we typically think about most production externalities as being negative. It's rare for those to be positive. The main cost has got to do with pollution, and in the sense, if we were adding up all the costs to society, we shouldn't just add up those marginal costs of the firm for producing these things in terms of their inputs that go into it, the labor costs and so forth, but also the cost to others down the road. So if you think about, for example, a situation where there's a factory producing something and it's putting its waste into the river, and that water goes downstream to where there's a livestock farm and those animals are going to drink that water, there's a cost that's not being considered by the factory that has to be borne by others who are external to that decision. And again, this is going to lead to a deadweight loss because the actual production that the free market dictates is going to be more than what the socially efficient amount is, and the price is going to be lower than the socially efficient price. It's not just water pollution and air pollution, there's also noise pollution, which is why most governments have some sort of law about when you can do construction activities in suburban areas, and also overfishing and things like this, where you've got these sort of public resources, and many others that you can think of as well, including the flip side of health activities such as obesity and so forth. So what's the real problem here and how can we fix it? Well, Robert Coase came along in 1960 with a very famous theorem, and which he spoke about in his book, The Problem of Social Cost. And he said, well, the issue that's really at the heart of these deadweight losses that can occur is a lack of property rights. Now, property rights being a very important part of any democratic civilization. The property rights is when owners have some exclusive and absolute legal rights to the resources and how they can be used. And he says, if you have these property rights and they're enforced and they're in place, then private parties can negotiate in such a way that will reach this socially efficient outcome anyway. Let's look at a simple example of this. So imagine that you're waiting at a bus stop, you don't like smoking, and there's a guy who's about to light up and smoke. Now, remember, we can put a price on happiness that people get from activities in terms of utility. So we're going to do that here. We'll say that the smoker values smoking that cigarette at $1 worth of happiness. Now you might say, well, it's a bit weird to put a price on this, but we've seen before that it makes sense in a modeling perspective. We know that if we offered the smoker, say, 5 cents not to smoke, he's going to say no. If we offer him $100 not to smoke, he's probably going to say yes. That means there has to be some price in between that he exactly values smoking at for his happiness. So it has to exist, and we just put it at $1 to make things simple. Now imagine that you incur a cost of having to smoke this secondhand smoke of $2 worth of cost. So you don't like it. He likes it. He gets $1 worth of happiness from smoking. You lose $2 worth of happiness by him smoking. And what about society? If we take the big picture perspective, we add up the happiness of the two people, we've lost $1. Society has lost $1 because of the activity of this person smoking. What about if there are property rights? Well, we can assign property rights to either the smoker or to the non-smoker. So let's say that the smoker has the right to smoke. Now we go into this private negotiation element, which is a key element of the Coase Theorem. So the non-smoker says to the smoker, hey, I will offer you $1.50 not to smoke that cigarette. Now, if the smoker is rational and he values the cigarette at $1, then it makes sense for him to take that $1.50 and not smoke. Meanwhile, for the non-smoker, they've made a 50% gain as well in terms of their happiness. It would have cost them $2 to suck in that secondhand smoke. Now there's no secondhand smoke, and it only costs them $1.50 to prevent it. It's kind of like these benefits of trade, which we saw before on both sides, the producer surplus and consumer surplus. So that's worked in this case. What about the other situation? I'll just move out of the way a bit. When we assign the property rights to the non-smoker. So the non-smokers get to dictate whether or not you can smoke. Well, in this case, the non-smoker is going to say, I don't want you to smoke because it hurts me more than you get a gain from it. And the smoker cannot pay enough, cannot pay more than $2 for the right to smoke, because that's not going to be in the smoker's best interest. So in both situations, we get the same result, which is the socially efficient result. No smoking occurs. And that's the key point here. It doesn't matter who gets the property rights, as long as somebody gets those property rights. And then a situation where private negotiations are possible will lead to the socially efficient solution. So that's the Coase theorem in theory. Now, of course, some things matter. For example, both the smoker and the non-smoker care about who gets the property rights, even though in theory the government shouldn't mind that much. So this is the Coase theorem in general, that private negotiation can solve these sort of externality issues, but only if there are no transaction costs. So transaction costs are any costs that the parties incur in the process of having to agree to and then follow through on some sort of bargain that they strike through this private negotiation. And Robert Coase said that if trade in an externality is possible, there are no transaction costs, then we have a situation where this bargaining can lead to an efficient outcome regardless of who we allocate the property rights to. Now, his theorem has been criticized by many people who've said there are very few situations where there are no transaction costs, and therefore the Coase theorem is great in theory but rarely ever applies in practice. Actually, if you read his book on the social cost thoroughly, he was almost arguing for exactly that position. One of the reasons that he specified these conditions in his theorem, such as there being no transaction costs, was because he went on to say this is very rare in real life, but still it's only this sort of extract without the context that he's known for. Okay, one of the reasons why we can see how these transaction costs matter is when we look at externalities in large markets. So not two people next to each other on a bus stop negotiating whether they smoke or not, but a situation that we're used to now where there are many buyers, many sellers. There's a private optimum in the middle, which before we just called the market equilibrium, but now we're going to refer to that particular point as this sort of private equilibrium. And now we need to add on these extra costs or benefits, which can go onto either the supply curve or the demand curve. So there are 4 different possibilities, but we'll stick with the common ones. So a positive consumption externality is something where if you consume something, it benefits others who are not in this particular transaction. So you go to university, you're benefiting society. We want to add in this positive externality. So what we do is we increase the demand curve. So our initial demand curve we call the private benefit, and now we add in this positive externality. And when we do that, we see that the efficient market equilibrium point has more consumption in terms of quantity and a higher price. And we need that higher price because we need our suppliers to be supplying more to our market. So that's the efficient point that we want to get to, but the free market is going to leave us instead at this market equilibrium point, the Q market and the P market, which means that at every extra quantity produced in between Q market and Q efficient, there are gains to society in terms of the point on the demand curve minus the point on the supply curve, that extra sort of willingness to pay minus willingness to accept. So if we shade in this difference between the demand curve and the supply curve, remember we're looking at the demand curve that takes into account the positive externality and the supply curve. So we shade in those vertical lines in between Q market and Q efficient. We get our familiar sort of shape for a dead weight loss, which is a triangle, which we can shade in. And that tells us the dead weight loss to society if we don't take account of this positive externality. Now, when there are many sellers, many buyers in a situation like this, we cannot have these sort of private negotiations between individual parties all the time. It's just simply not possible, let alone the fact that it would cost a fortune. So Coase conditions don't apply anymore in this situation. Okay, let's look at the other very common situation, which is the effect of a negative production externality, such as a firm producing electricity, and we're talking in terms of the pollution to society. So we've got S1, which is the private cost, and we've got the demand curve. And here we need to take into account that for every unit produced, there's that private cost in terms of the supplier's marginal cost curve, plus this external cost to society. So we're adding vertically to the supply curve. We're adding in this extra element, the negative externality, which leads to S2, which is our social cost. And again, what we see is the point that we want to be at, this efficient equilibrium, would see less production in society and also a higher price in society. And so what's the deadweight loss? Well, the deadweight loss is in terms of this extra production, which means if we start at Q efficient, we move to the right, every extra bit that's being produced more than the efficient equilibrium quantity sees the cost being higher than the benefit, as in S2 is higher than the demand curve. So we take those vertical differences all the way along to Q market, and again, we end up with our familiar looking triangle, which is the deadweight loss. And again, there are high transaction costs in these sort of situations. So Coase conditions don't apply. And then the solution instead is not to rely on these sort of private negotiations, but here the case can be made for government interventions. So that's how we draw things on our normal market equilibrium sort of graphs. The question is, if we know what the efficient level should be for a market, how can we get there in a situation where there are externalities? Well, we've talked about Coase Theorem and these sort of private negotiations, but besides a situation where there's, like I said, a factory and a farm with a river and the two of them can just sort it out themselves, it's very rare that these sort of private negotiations actually hold. Direct government intervention makes a lot more sense, and there are three different ways that they can do that. One's called command and control, one's called taxes and subsidies, and one's called tradable permits. Now these latter two fall into market-based instruments, whereas the first is obviously a little bit more authoritarian, and we've seen that one for example when it comes to the case of UQ and smoking. So command and control is when the government just says, you can't do this anymore, or you can only do it up to this level and then you've got to stop. So these are laws, for example, to limit the amount of pollution that you can produce, building height restrictions in terms of externalities affecting your view and so forth. We saw this just yesterday at Kangaroo Point. 2 houses were removed because they were going against the character of the area. And UQ in 2018 decided to ban all smoking from its campus. Now these seem like very simple solutions to ensure that we deal with the externality, but one of the issues is that firms have no incentives to try to find better solutions or to improve their cost reduction technology, which is also, we've seen before, one of the arguments against some of the ways to regulate monopolies, because again, you want to regulate them in such a way that the monopoly still has those incentives to invest in research and development and technology and so forth. Therefore, in a lot of settings, market-based instruments are preferred. So even though we're saying that there are market failures, and that's an argument for the government to intervene, we're still saying that the government can use instruments from our free markets in order to get closer to those efficiency gains. So the idea is to try to provide incentives for the agents in our economies, either on the production side or on the consumption side, to change their behavior in ways that sort of do what we want them to do. So taxes are one such way to do that. We've seen before that when you apply a tax in a free market, it leads to a deadweight loss because firms produce less than they otherwise would. But if we have a situation with a negative externality, we exactly want firms to produce less. So Taxes can help to do that in cases of negative externalities. When we want consumption to be higher than it currently is, then providing subsidies can help. For example, your university education, or for things like the flu vaccine or so forth. So we'll go back to pollution again. Now we know that there are benefits from reducing pollution, but we know that there are also costs to firms to try to reduce that negative externality, that environmental damage. And they may differ from firm to firm as well. And we'll see that that's important. So as a firm tries to get greener and tries to continually reduce its emissions, the additional benefits become smaller and the costs become larger. And it sort of goes back to, in any sort of production process, this increasing marginal costs. So making your firm a bit greener by just a little bit is not that difficult to do. But after a while, you've done all the very easy things to do to increase your environmental rating of your company, and then it gets harder and harder to find things that you can do to reduce your emissions. So the marginal cost of reducing emissions becomes greater and greater. So what's the economically efficient level of production? Well, it's still where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. It's just that we've got to make sure that our benefits and costs take into account these externalities as well. But it's still the same principle that we've seen in our marginal analysis. So if the total marginal benefit is greater than the total marginal costs, it makes sense to keep reducing our emissions. But at some point, we'll get to a point where perhaps the benefit of reducing the next ton of emissions is actually less than how much it costs us. And then further reduction will just make us worse off. So again, we want to keep reducing until we reach that sweet spot where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Let's see how this marginal analysis works on our familiar graph. So let's take an example where we've got the marginal cost of reducing pollution and the marginal benefit from reducing pollution. So what we've got on the x-axis here is the reductions in emissions, which is something that you could explore more in the future if you ever take an environmental economics course. This is a very common graph that's explored in great detail. And on the y-axis, we've got the cost or the benefit in terms of dollars per ton of these reductions. And let's take a case which is to the left of the equilibrium point, say where the cost is $250 and the reduction here is 7,000 tons per year. Well, here's a situation where the marginal benefit from pollution reduction is $250 per ton, and it's only costing us $175 per ton to do it. So it's actually better for society at this point if we keep reducing. But what if we're on the right side of the sweet spot, the middle of the X? Well, then we could have a situation where it costs us $225 to reduce the next ton, but the benefit is only $150 per ton. So rather than taking a very philosophical, we should always try to make the environment better until we get down to exactly zero emissions, this sort of takes into account those costs versus benefit, which can be a very difficult thing to do, and most policy decisions do take that into account to some extent. In the more extreme examples, for example, in the COVID debate, you're actually weighing up benefits in terms of people's lives versus economic cost to everyone else. So then you're actually having to put prices on people's lives or on people's life years, as they often do in health economics as well. So it's a very difficult thing to do because you're putting prices on essentially intangible objects, but that's the way that market analysis works to achieve socially efficient outcomes, and sometimes tough decisions need to be made. So of course, if we've got the left and the right of the sweet spot being inefficient for the different reasons, you already know by now where we need to end up, and that's right smack bang in the middle. So there's a situation where the marginal cost from pollution reduction and the marginal benefit are both exactly $200 per ton. And that gives us the economically efficient level of production, of pollution reduction rather. So what can we do if we've got a situation where the free market is leading to producers producing more than this economically efficient level? Or we can impose a tax, and if we do the tax in a smart way, we can do it such that the tax actually, because it increases the producer's marginal cost, leads them to reducing their production, their quantity supply, to exactly the point where we get to for this efficient point. So the aim of the tax is to get the producer to internalize the cost of this negative externality by applying this tax to the same amount. And typically speaking, from a practical perspective, it makes more sense to do this for the producers, even though theoretically it makes no difference. Theoretically, we could still apply it to the consumers. For a positive externality, well, it's just the flip side. We want them to produce more, and we've seen that subsidies can do this. So some sort of subsidy can be provided to increase supply or demand. And it can be to either the producer or to the consumer. Often the consumers get some way to claim things back, which means that they're going to consume more, and then essentially the government is subsidizing them because you make a claim for a rebate or something like this. Or it can go to suppliers as well. Then there's the very complicated and very hotly debated tradable emissions allowances process. And that's trying to essentially create a market that deals with these externalities, a market in which producers can buy and sell allowances for how much they can emit. Now, this seems like an extreme market-based instrument. Why would we want to go to this level of allowing some firms to actually emit more if they're willing to pay for it? Well, actually, this market-based instrument makes a lot of sense. The reason is that when we look at the previous examples are theoretically fine to apply a tax if all firms are pretty much the same when it comes to their cost structure. That is, all firms to the same degree find it easy to reduce their emissions to some level, and then it gets very hard, but that cost structure looks similar. But that's often not the case. So think of two firms, and we want to get these two firms in total to reduce their emissions by 10 tons. So we could say to both of them, okay, 5 each. You both got to reduce your emissions by 5 each. We could do that. But what if one of the firms is actually finds it very easy to reduce their emissions? And in fact, by the time they get to 5, it wouldn't have cost them that much more to reduce the 6th ton or the 7th ton. But they decide not to because we told them 5 is 5. The second firm, it's really, really tough. Whatever they're producing, it means that it costs them a lot of money to try to reduce their emissions. So they've got a very steep marginal cost curve in terms of emission reduction. By the time they get to 5, it is extremely painful. In fact, they might even decide that it's so costly that they just shut down entirely because they can't deal with these sort of restrictions. Well, it would be better in terms of society's resources to actually get the first firm to, say, reduce their emissions by 7 tons. For the second one, just ask them to do 3 tons, something like this. That would be good. And in theory, we might be able to do this by applying different sorts of taxes or so forth if we knew each firm's cost structure. But as a government, that's very difficult. Just like when governments try to regulate monopolies, we don't really know the cost structure of these firms. The same way, it's very difficult for us to try to understand the differences in the cost structures for reducing emissions across all firms in an industry. What we can do is give these emissions permits to certain firms and then allow them to buy and trade those permits. Because if we did that in the case of, say, our 2 firms, we give them both 5 permits. What's going to happen? Well, the second firm, the one for it's very, very difficult, they're actually going to say, I'd really like to be able to emit a couple more tons. I'm willing to pay the first firm quite a lot of money if they do more of the reductions so that I only have to do 2 or 3 tons of reductions. So we can allow those firms to kind of sort themselves out and efficiently allocate who reduces the bulk of the emissions without us as the government having to know what their internal cost structures are. So that's how the emissions trading scheme, for example, works in theory, and in general, it is the best market-based instrument that we have for reductions across an industry with heterogeneity in terms of these sort of cost structure. Of course, there are other questions that make things practically difficult to put forward. The first was that this emissions trading scheme was politically not very tenable, as we saw in recent decades in Australian politics. The second is, of course, this overlapping generations kind of idea. That is, that the older people in society have less incentive to want to invest now in protecting the future, and often they're the ones who are making the decisions on boards and governments as well. And of course, we have this other issue that we are essentially doing things where the benefits will not be reaped as much by our society, but by future generations. And that's something that economics doesn't help that much with, at least not at the level that we're discussing here. Now let's move on to the next topic for today, which is public goods. So let's go back to our standard assumptions chart that I'm sure you're sick of by now, but it's kind of a useful sort of benchmark to keep us focused. We've looked at externalities. Now we'll look at a situation where goods are not excludable and rival. So we're adding in two new terms here, and we want to see what happens. So when goods are not excludable and rival, then we have a public good. You've probably heard about public goods before. You're certainly familiar with them. Here are some examples to jog your memory. So education, health, national defense, fresh air, and open source software are all examples of public goods because they fulfill these two criteria: non-rivalry and non-excludability. So what are these? Well, non-rivalry means that one individual's consumption of the good does not impede another individual from consuming it as well. So if we think of our examples of private goods, which we've looked at so far, such as a coffee, if you drink that coffee that you bought, I don't get to drink it, I'm not very happy. So be it, of course, you bought it. But in a case where a good has the characteristic of non-rivalry, you can consume it and I can consume it. In other words, the marginal cost of providing the public good to another person is zero. What about non-excludability? Well, that means that you cannot stop somebody else from using the good. Now, in our society, we have property rights, like most societies. It means that if you buy the cup of coffee, I'm not allowed to come and take it from you, which means that I'm excluded from consuming that good. So these two characteristics then give us four different types of goods, depending on whether or not they are fulfilled. That is, a good can be rival or non-rival, and a good can be excludable or non-excludable. So let's look at some of the different types of goods we'll get in each of these categories. For example, if a good is excludable and rival, we've essentially got a private good, and those are the goods we've been looking at so far in this course. So anything that you can buy: coffee, bananas, oil, hamburgers, and so forth. If a good is excludable but non-rival, that means that the marginal cost of another person using this good is essentially zero, such as if I upload my lectures to Blackboard, I can exclude people who are not within this course from accessing those lectures, but it doesn't cost me anything if somebody else wants to watch my lecture. And the same goes for things like cable TV. What about things that are rival but non-excludable? Non-excludable means that you can't keep people out from them. Well, it would be something like UQ library spaces or highways that often get quite sort of clogged, those sort of things. These are examples where you can't stop people from using these things, any sort of public library as well. Or a very popular beach, say sort of Bondi Beach. One's enjoyment might go down the more people who come there, but you cannot stop people from going there. What we're interested in particularly are those that are both non-rival and non-excludable. Situations like Australia's national defence. It's not possible to defend the country for just some of its inhabitants, but not for others of its inhabitants. If you boost national defence, you're benefiting everyone, so it's non-excludable. It's also non-rival. Benefiting Australia's national defence, the marginal cost of helping one extra person in Australia is essentially zero. And the same goes for things like fresh air and safe neighbourhoods. We're mainly going to focus on pure public goods, and that's when situations where these goods are perfectly non-rivalrous and non-excludable. There are also important goods that are close to being public goods but are not quite there, so up to a certain point. We call those impure public goods. So we can look at some goods that are excludable but non-rivalrous, so they're similar to public goods but not quite, such as pay TV, because you need a subscription in order to apply for that, or any sort of private beach. And other ones that are non-excludable but rivalrous and are similar to public goods up until a point. So something like computer spaces in the library is an example of that. Before you reach the full capacity of those computer spaces, then the marginal cost of adding one more is essentially zero. But once you reach that full capacity, then you have an impure public good. And the same goes for a highway where there's no congestion. Adding one more car doesn't really matter. The marginal cost is essentially zero until you reach those sort of traffic jams. So let's see how this works in the context of our models, our supply and demand models. And we'll see how these public goods relate to marginal social benefits, externalities, and efficiencies. So we've got two students, Anna and Zoe, they're flatmates, and they want to hire a cleaner. How many hours of cleaning per week should they get a contract for? Well, when we want to put this graph together, usually we would take individual demand for a private good and add it horizontally. For a public good, and this is a key difference, aggregate demand sums up individual demand vertically. That is, take this example here, we've got Anna's individual demand, we've got Zoe's individual demand, and the aggregate demand, the grey line, is the vertical sum. So the marginal social benefit is the vertical sum of these individual marginal benefits. And we can see that Anna has larger individual demand, so she seems to value the cleaning more. For a given amount of hours, she values it more. In total, they're willing to pay not more together than $75 per hour for an hour of cleaning, and they're not willing to buy more than 10 hours in total. A very famous theorem that applies to these sort of situations is the Samuelson condition, which states that the efficient quantity of a public good is found by setting the sum of these individual marginal benefits equal to the marginal cost. So in other words, getting aggregate demand and then finding the intersection with marginal cost. The key difference is really that we add these things up vertically. So let's say that the price is $30 per hour, and we'll call that some sort of constant marginal cost, because that's the cost that Anna and Zoe will have to pay for an additional hour of cleaning. What's the efficient number of hours that they should hire a cleaner for? Well, the Samuelson condition says that we take the sum of their individual benefits, which is this capital sigma symbol in Greek that we use in mathematics. We take the sum of their marginal individual benefits, which gives us this aggregate demand. We set that equal to the marginal social benefit, which here is this constant marginal cost, or the price. And that tells us that 6 hours is the socially optimal amount that should be consumed. Now, this is exactly what we do in private markets, and we find that it works perfectly well. We get our aggregate demand curve by summing up horizontally our individual demand curves. We set that intersection at the supply curve, and boom, we're done. Here we have a little bit of a problem, because for public goods we don't get this intersection. Now, why not? What happens? Well, at a price of $30, have a look just at Zoe's individual demand curve, that sort of orangey curve there, or brownie curve. I'm colorblind, I'm not sure, but you'll work it out. We can see that Zoe's never willing to pay $30 for an hour's cleaning, so she's not interested at all. If we just leave it to Anna, Anna's going to consume less. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Here we go. I'll put this one up here. That's what I wanted to show you. So you can see that Anna at $30 is going to consume less. She's only going to consume 4 hours. And when she's consuming 4 hours, what's Zoe going to do? Well, nothing. She's just going to sit at home and reap the benefits of the cleaner coming into the house. So Zoe's in effect getting 4 hours, but she's not willing to pay anything at $30 an hour. So she's free riding, so to speak. In general, the total is going to be 4 hours that Anna's going to pay for herself. And we know that the efficient amount is 6 hours. So there's an under provision. Now, what's this free riding? You've probably heard the term before, but it actually comes from economics. Free riding denotes the action of enjoying a good without paying for it. Now, we usually talk about it in the sense of people getting on buses and leaving without paying for a ticket. But here it's any sort of situation where there's a non-excludable nature of a public good. And this is the key concept that leads to this under provision. So essentially then a public good is kind of like an extreme case of a positive externality. Remember, in positive externalities, we have a situation where the market underprovides. We wish there was more happening to society, such as bringing in flowers into your office so that everyone enjoys the smell. But it's an extreme case because the benefit that is accrued doesn't just go to whoever provides the good or consumes the good. It goes to everyone. You can't exclude that. So it's another way of defining this non-rivalry. So how do we fix this sort of situation? Because we've got both that the individual can benefit from someone else's public good provision and that an individual cannot be stopped from enjoying it. So all the conditions are there for free riding. Well, government intervention makes sense. We want to boost the consumption up to this socially optimal amount. So for Zoe and Anna, we need to get it to 6 hours. How do we do it? Well, the common mechanism is through tax. And again, this is another situation that sort of underpins the economic fundamentals of the economic left. The government can get to this efficient production by taxing both Zoe and Anna and then using that money to hire a cleaner for 6 hours. So the government hires a cleaner for 6 hours and taxes Anna $20 per hour and taxes Zoe $10 per hour, and we get there. We get to the socially efficient amount and solve the problem that both Anna and Zoe couldn't work out by themselves. In theory, that's great, but as always, there's a catch in practice, and that is that the marginal benefit to Anna and the marginal benefit to Zoe are not common knowledge. They're not known to everyone. They're not known to the government. And in fact, they've got an incentive to understate their true valuations, trying to free ride on the other's provision. In exactly the same way that in theory, the government taking income tax from you and I and then applying that to public goods should benefit all of us. And we do like that system in general, but it doesn't solve the fact that there's an incentive for us to try to cheat on our taxes, to understate our earnings, and so forth. So there's always that sort of individual selfish trade-off. So how does the government try to deal with this? Well, it might not be able to apply taxation perfectly, but it can at least try to get it as fair as possible. And there are two main principles that a government employs to target this fairness. The first is that it taxes according to its ability to pay, and that leads to these progressive taxation systems that play a big feature not only in the Australian economy, but in other Western democratic societies, particularly in the Scandinavian sort of models that take it to the extreme. So this is that those who earn more should have to pay more, and that's sort of an element of this fairness principle. The second is about taxing pay as you go, and that means adding in things such as tolls to tunnels that go into inner city Sydney or something like this. So those who use these sort of things more often should have to pay a little bit more for those sort of things. And this sort of combination of ability to pay and pay as you go try to tackle the fairness issues that are left by the fact that the government doesn't know what the marginal benefits are for every individual in society, for every sort of good that could be provided publicly. So what have we looked at today? Well, we've looked at a couple of violations again of perfect competition and situations where government intervention kind of makes sense. It's often welfare increasing when there are externalities, and this explains a lot of the government interventions, taxes or subsidies in various markets in our society. The Coase Theorem is a very important theorem theoretically that says that private bargaining can also solve the problem of these sort of externalities, but there are very strict conditions and they're often not suitable in practice. And finally, the government provision of public goods can help to solve some sort of coordination and free riding problems that people often face when it comes to goods that are non-rival or non-excludable. The way to fund those sort of provision comes through taxation, which again is difficult in practice, but by adopting these two principles, this sort of ability to pay and pay as you go, the government can try to do its best job with that. So this takes us to the end of the microeconomic component of this course. We've been talking a lot about the government. The government's going to play a big role in the back end of this course in macroeconomics. Thanks for listening, and join us next time for the first of the macroeconomic lectures.